Well, can I give you a welcome to this gathering tonight, and a welcome to one and all, and a welcome to those who join us by stream as well this evening. Tonight we're going to hear Nathan speak about spirituality in the Lord of the Rings. Now, just a wee introduction to Nathan, to those of you who perhaps don't know him quite so well. Nathan has studied for many years at Edinburgh University, undergraduate and postgraduate work, and a PhD, and then the Hope Trust Fellow. Nathan's speciality is not actually Tolkien, but is early modern Scottish church history. But as a side interest, Nathan's had an interest in Tolkien and other writers like Tolkien over the years. Nathan, I think, was first introduced to Tolkien through the films, which I took him to. And then I remember Games Workshop and the Lord of the Rings little figures that we used to collect and play with as well. And then Nathan took it a little bit further and explored perhaps the deeper meanings of Tolkien's writing, including the Lord of the Rings. So we're going to get some of the fruit of that tonight, and we're looking forward to that. Just a wee bit about the order of this evening. We're going to have Nathan's talk, which will be around 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have a time for questions, and then inevitably there will be refreshments, that is tea and cake, through in the little hall at the back of the pulpit, so we can look forward to further chat and further questions and further ideas, or just enjoying the tea and cake perhaps through in the hall afterwards. So without anything more to say, I'll just pass over to Nathan, who's going to talk to us this evening on the spirituality of the Lord of the Rings.
The song I can sing is but shreds, one remembers, of golden imaginings fashioned in sleep, a whispered tale told by the withering embers of old things far off that but few hearts keep. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was born at the end of the 19th century, and he grew up in a place near Birmingham on the peripheries called Sarehole Mill, which was a lovely pastoral bit of countryside. And as a boy, Tolkien loved mythology and fairy stories. He was fascinated by the Iliad and the Odyssey. And with his younger brother, they would go off into the woods close by and play make-believe. They would pretend to be knights fighting dragons and ogres and devious trolls. This love of fairy story Tolkien retained through his adult life. He was a professor first at the University of Leeds and then at Oxford in English, particularly ancient languages. He was a philologist at heart. But what Tolkien saw was that these languages, they're sustained by the stories that are told through them. And so he had a great love not just for the vocabulary and grammar, but for the stories too, such as Beowulf or the legend of King Arthur. He was aware, though, that he lived at a time of great change. He lived through 2 world wars. He saw the effect of industrialization and urbanization upon his childhood home, which had once been a countryside setting, turned into a suburb of Birmingham. He saw how economic, social, and religious change was impacting those around him. And the words that we heard at the beginning come from one of his very first poems in 1914. And we can see even at that point that Tolkien was worried that modern society was losing something. It was losing the deep truths that he found in those fairy stories, in those myths. A whispered tale told by the withering embers of old things far off that but few hearts keep. And so for Tolkien, I think a lot of his writing, a lot of his fairy stories and myths were an attempt to retrieve and preserve some of those things which he felt society was losing. He had his great literary breakthrough in 1937 with the publication of The Hobbit, which is a children's story. It follows the adventures of Bilbo Baggins as he helps a group of dwarves reclaim their homeland from an evil dragon. The publishers were somewhat surprised that fantasy did so well, and given the popularity of the book, they asked Tolkien to write a sequel. This he did over the next 10 to 15 years, and between 1954 and 1955, he had published The Lord of the Rings, a trilogy, The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King. This was even more popular than The Hobbit. At the moment, I think estimates suggest that 150 million copies have been sold worldwide, with it being translated into around 50 languages. It's also been the subject of a highly popular film franchise, which may have brought it into the mainstream in a way that it hadn't been before. Directed by Peter Jackson, the final film, The Return of the King, made $1 billion at the box office. I think that was a record at the time. And it received 11 Oscars, which is the most of any film, along with Ben-Hur and James Cameron's Titanic. And more recently, just this year, Amazon have produced a new TV series based on the Lord of the Rings material, The Rings of Power. It's also influenced other significant fantasy stories, such as J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter and George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones, and even the music of Led Zeppelin. If you listen to the lyrics, you will hear Ringwraiths and Gollum appearing at various points. So The Lord of the Rings has had a huge impact upon Western popular culture. Now, before we get into the theme for tonight, it might just be worth having a quick summary of the plot. The main character is Frodo Baggins. He is the nephew of Bilbo, who was the main character of The Hobbit. And from his uncle, Frodo receives a magical golden ring. Now, it turns out that this ring belongs to the Dark Lord of Middle-earth. That's the continent in which this takes place. And this Dark Lord, whose name is Sauron, he wants this ring back, because with this ring, he will have the power to take over the whole world. He will be able to defeat his enemies, destroy them, or make them into his slaves. Frodo can't hide the ring, and he can't lock it away, because Sauron knows that he has it, or at least his uncle had it, and where he lives. The only way to deal with it is to destroy this ring. And that can only be done in one place. You'll see in this picture, there's a volcano on the right-hand side of the screen. That's where the ring was forged, Mount Doom, in the heart of the Dark Lord's country. And it is only there where the ring can be destroyed. So, the Lord of the Rings consists in a quest, an epic journey, from Frodo's home in the very west of Middle-earth, the Shire, to Mordor, the very east, where Sauron's domain is and where this volcano is, in an attempt to destroy this ring. I think one of the reasons that people love The Lord of the Rings is it's brimming with imagination. Tolkien was brilliant at creating a world filled with cultures and peoples. Each of them had their own history and even their own languages. He developed a number of languages for the story. Part of what gives it the taste of reality is that Tolkien drew on a number of different sources, historical and mythological, to build these different cultures, to give them a sense of rootedness within our own world. So he drew on stories like the Iliad and the Odyssey. He based some cultures on Egyptian architecture and aesthetic. He turned to the fall of Rome and the Aeneid from that period. And moving towards his own area of study, he engaged with the Norse sagas, such as the stories about Odin and Thor. He incorporated aspects of Anglo-Saxon culture, like the poem Beowulf. He used the tales of King Arthur, and he even used material from 19th century retrievals and representations of these older myths, such as Wagner's Ring Cycle. However, I think that the moral center of the story, the framework in which right and wrong is determined, is fundamentally a Christian one, and that the narrative has, on a kind of structural level, a Christian ethos in various ways. And I think we can see that this shouldn't be a surprise, because Tolkien himself was raised and remained a devout Roman Catholic. And along with C.S. Lewis, who was one of his closest friends, Tolkien believed that mythology had the power to reveal Christian truth, and that his own fantasy writings would have the ability to evoke Christian faith. Indeed, he went as far as saying in one of his letters that The Lord of the Rings was, in its revision, an explicitly Roman Catholic work. I think we can see this Christian aspect in a number of characters, in particular, the ways in which certain characters resemble aspects of Jesus Christ. Let's do 3 of the main ones. So first, Gandalf. Gandalf is your archetypal wizard, not just in appearance. Of course, he's got the pointy hat and the staff and the big bushy beard, but more than that, he's a mentor. He's a source of constant guidance and wisdom for Frodo as he embarks upon his quest. Whenever the characters seem to be in a tight spot, Gandalf knows what to do. And I think this is partly why many people love Gandalf, because he's a source of comfort, assurance, and security. Now, there's a part in the story where Frodo sets off on his quest, and he has with him a group of people who are going to help him complete his quest, called the Fellowship. Now, this group must get from one side of a mountain to another, and they have to go underneath the mountain, through ancient tunnels. As they are approaching the exit, they have one final obstacle to cross. It's a bridge, a very narrow bridge which only one of them can go across at a time. And as they are about to do this, they are attacked by an ancient demon. This being is filled with fire and shadow and darkness. Its name is the Balrog, and it is too powerful for most of the company. It poses an existential threat to the quest. Gandalf, knowing this, allows the rest of the Fellowship to cross, and then turns to face this demon. He famously says to it that it will not pass him, and then using his staff, he breaks the bridge. The demon falls into the abyss below, the bridge breaking underneath it. But as it does so, you will see in its right hand there is a whip. And using this whip, it catches Gandalf and drags him into the pit below with him. They then engage in a titanic struggle, fighting from the lowest dungeon to the highest peak. Gandalf eventually triumphs, but is himself mortally wounded. So we can see that Gandalf sacrifices his life for the rest of the Fellowship, that they can get away, and is able to conquer this ancient demon. But that is not the end of his story. In the second book, The Two Towers, we discover that Gandalf has come back to life. He has been resurrected. But he's not quite the same as he once before. He seems to be more powerful. His magic seems to have more of an effect. Just by his words, he's able to command certain characters to do certain things. This change is manifested in his name. Before, he was Gandalf the Grey, wearing grey robes. Now he is Gandalf the White. And his very presence seems to have an even more powerful effect than it did before. When many of the characters are in a battle, when they're facing the foes of evil, they are often in a state of terror and despair. They're facing monstrous things which they don't think they can defeat. But when Gandalf enters the scene, when they see him and see who they would call the White Rider, they feel hope and courage. They feel emboldened to be able to stand fast against those evil powers. I think we can see a number of parallels between Gandalf and Jesus. Like Gandalf, Jesus dies and sacrifices himself for other people to save the world. But his death is not the end. He is resurrected. And like Gandalf, he seems changed after his resurrection. He seems to have new powers. He can move between walls or disappear at his command. And when the disciples describe their experience of the risen Christ, they describe it as their hearts burning within them. There is a sense then that the very presence of Jesus is able to elicit hope, faith, and love. Let's move on to the second major character, Aragorn. Now, Aragorn is a ranger in the wild. He lives on the very peripheries of society. While all of the rest of the characters sleep soundly at night, he is out there fighting those monstrous beasts who would do damage to civilization. As the story progresses, it turns out that Aragorn is the heir to a country which has not had a monarch in a very long time. And indeed, this country, which its capital is a great city, has come under mortal threat. The Dark Lord has sent his forces against it to destroy it and annihilate it utterly. It's up to Aragorn to save his city and then become king. To do this, he's going to need a very special kind of army, one that's strong enough to defeat a much larger host. He turns to those men who live in the mountains. Now, these men had promised a former king of this country to come and serve him and fight for him when the time was right. But when that king called them, they didn't fight for him. They stayed at home. And so this king cursed them that they would never be able to find rest until they had fulfilled their pledge. Thus they linger on as ghosts under the mountain. Aragorn goes through the mountain, underneath it, into the paths of the dead. And there he summons this ghostly army to fight for him, which they do. Using their strength, he is able to save his city, and they are released from lingering on earth. They find their rest at last. In time, Aragorn does become king, and he ushers in a new age, one of healing, of prosperity, and of peace. Aragorn mirrors certain aspects of Christ. In the Apostles' Creed, which is a statement of fundamental Christian belief, after Christians say that Christ died and he was buried, they say he descended into hell or into Hades, the realm of the dead. And many Christian traditions speak of Christ when he was in that situation, breaking the bonds and chains that were within hell to allow those who were trapped there to escape and find freedom. This is called the harrowing of hell, and it very much mirrors Aragorn rescuing or releasing these ghosts from lingering. Moreover, Christ is the new king, or the king of Israel. When the Israelites were under occupation, they were under the Babylonian Empire, they didn't have a monarch, but they believed that when the Messiah returned, that he would be a king descended from King David, and that he would usher in a new age of prosperity and peace. This would be akin to heaven being on earth. In the book of Revelation, this is depicted as the New Jerusalem, a restoration of this city into something even greater than it was. This is a great city which is made of gold, and it has 12 foundations with 12 gates. And there is some sense in which Aragorn's city, which is the white city in that corner there, with its 7 levels and 7 gates, mirrors this reality. Our final character is Frodo, the main hero of the quest. Now, Frodo is a hobbit. He is like a human being, but 3 to 4 foot tall. And Frodo doesn't have particular great powers. He's not magical. He's not particularly intelligent. He is an everyman, as it were. His task is to carry the ring to Mordor. And remember that the ring of power is what Sauron wants, the Dark Lord. It's the key to evil dominating the world. It's the instrument that darkness needs to take over. And Frodo takes this burden upon himself, and it is a great weight, emotionally, morally, and physically. It literally drags him to the floor at various points. And it is through Frodo's many trials and sufferings, his experiences of many forms of wounds and pains, that the quest is completed. Just as Frodo is the ring bearer, so Christ is described as the sin bearer. He is the one that takes upon himself the evil we have done. And it is through his sufferings, via crucifixion, that we are redeemed. The book of Isaiah prophesies that Christ would do the following. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. So there is a sense in which the bearing of the ring and suffering of Frodo saves Middle-earth, as does the bearing of sin and the suffering of Christ is the redemption of humanity. But this is where the parallel breaks down. At the climax of the story, Frodo does reach Mount Doom, and he gets inside. He's on a platform above the fire. All he needs to do is drop the ring into the lava below, and Sauron will be defeated. His power will be broken. But at that moment, when he can claim victory, the following happens. Then Frodo stirred and spoke with a clear voice. I have come, but I do not choose now to do what I came to do. I will not do this deed. The ring is mine. Then taking the ring, he placed it on his finger and vanished from sight. This is something of a surprise, I think, to many people. When you think of fairy stories, oftentimes the hero, of their own will, their courage, maybe some ingenuity, they are able to overcome the darkness or the evil power, and victory is assured. But in this story, the main character fails. He takes the ring for himself. To understand why, we need to explore the nature of the ring. It was created by the Dark Lord, and within its very being is all of his cruelty, his malice, and his will to dominate all life. And it has a kind of agency of its own. It has an ability to act in a way. And what it does is it tempts people to desire it for a number of different reasons. For some, it's just because they want it as a precious jewel, that it's something that they see as beautiful, and this compels them to have it as an object they can treasure for themselves. For others, it plays on maybe more noble desires. One character wants the ring because he believes with it he will have the power to defend his country from the Dark Lord. Another believes that the ring is tempting him because he would do good with it. He would institute justice across Middle-earth and be able to defeat Sauron. But in the end, all of them, and maybe even those more based from the very beginning, it turns into a desire for power itself. That they want this ring because ultimately they will be elevated to rule over others, whether it's a little kingdom, a great kingdom, or the whole of the world. This is ultimately deceptive, though. The ring is promising these things. It's tempting you to believe you can get this power through it. But ultimately, only the Dark Lord can use this ring. Only Sauron is able to use it. So these temptations, although it seems to be true, is actually not the case. It's an illusion. But nonetheless, the desires it's able to stimulate within people are overwhelming and overpowering. Some will steal the ring if they can. Others murder other characters so that they can get the ring. It becomes a kind of madness or overdriving frenzy that takes over various characters. When we understand this, we can see why Frodo failed. He had done better than anybody else in resisting the ring. He had gone to the very place where it was created and not given in. But at that point, his will broke and he succumbed to the temptation. I think Tolkien's saying at least two things with this. One concerns our relationship to power. Many of us have been influenced by Lord Acton's saying that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think Tolkien's very much chiming in with this. There's this sense that if any of us have some amount of power, or indeed the opportunity of absolute power, we would all find it not just difficult, but impossible to give it up of our own free will. We would need something beyond ourselves to help us to do so. That's why when Frodo has that chance, he has the chance to destroy this thing which allows for tyrannous absolute power. He doesn't. But there's a deeper comment about human nature as well. I think we can see this by looking at the Genesis story of the fall. In the book of Genesis, God creates the Garden of Eden, a kind of paradise on earth. And there he creates Adam and Eve, their names meaning in Hebrew, man and woman. He tells Adam and Eve that they can eat the fruit of any tree in the garden, except for two: the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the tree of eternal life. In time, Adam and Eve do eat the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and God casts them out of the garden for a life of toil and suffering. Whether we take this story literally or metaphorically, the fact that their names are man and woman, I think indicates something, that within all of us there is this tendency towards choosing the wrong option or the evil option. That if we had been in the garden too, we would have made that decision as well. There is a propensity towards self-destruction. And Frodo's failure at Mount Doom is a representation of that. That if any of us had been put in that situation, we too would have fell. But the story doesn't end there. There is respite for Frodo. And to see this, we need to look at a conversation that Frodo has with Gandalf towards the beginning of the story. In it, they are discussing the creature Gollum, who has informed the Dark Lord, he was tortured to do so, that Bilbo, or Frodo, has the ring. And they are discussing the fact that Bilbo, in a previous episode, had the opportunity to kill Gollum. So we pick it up with Frodo saying, "What a pity that Bilbo did not stab that vile creature when he had the chance." "Pity?" said Gandalf. "It was pity that stayed his hand. Pity and mercy, not to strike without need." "I am sorry," said Frodo, "but I am frightened, and I do not feel any pity for Gollum." "You have not seen him?" Gandalf broke in. "No, and I don't want to," said Frodo. "I can't understand you. Do you mean to say that you and the elves have let him live on after all those horrible deeds? Now at any rate he is as bad as an orc, and just an enemy. He deserves death." "Deserves it? I dare say he does. Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be too hasty to deal out death in judgment, for even the very wise cannot see all ends. I have not much hope that Gollum can be cured before he dies, but there is a chance of it, and he is bound up with the fate of the ring. My heart tells me that he has some part to play yet, for good or for ill, before the end." Later in the book, Frodo and his companion Sam are attacked by Gollum. Gollum loves the ring, he really wants it, and he's murdered somebody in the past to possess it. Frodo and Sam are able to subdue him, and at that point, Frodo has the choice whether to kill him or not, and you can see this episode here on the screen. At that moment, Frodo has pity for Gollum, and he decides to show him mercy. He spares his life, asking Gollum to take them to Mordor as their guide. Now, this is important because the mercy of Frodo then plays in later to the situation we find ourselves at with Frodo's failure. As Frodo takes the ring for himself, Gollum returns and attacks once again. He manages to bite Frodo's finger off, which has the ring on it, and then take it for itself. And in absolute glee, he dances and jumps for joy. He's finally reunited with his beloved. But then he slips, he falls off the edge, and he falls into the lava below. The ring is destroyed and Sauron is defeated. Tolkien, in one of his letters, makes the point that if Frodo had killed Gollum when he had the chance, Gollum wouldn't have been there to interfere. He wouldn't have been there to intervene, and thus the ring wouldn't have been destroyed. It was because Frodo was merciful that the conditions were such that the ring could be destroyed. Forgiveness was the instrument of salvation. And this he connects with Jesus' teachings on forgiveness, that just as God has forgiven us, we should forgive others. Jesus describes the love of God as like that in the parable of the prodigal son. There was once a young man who asked his father for his half of the inheritance, rather impudently. He takes it and then goes off and lives a life of luxury, spending his money for pleasure. But then the money runs out, and a famine hits, and he has no money left. Recognizing his dire situation, the young man decides to return home, but realizing that he had been rather rude to his father and had shamed him, recognizes he can't just return as a son, but maybe by offering himself as a servant, he will be allowed to go back. As the son is walking along the road back to his home, his father sees him, and running down the road, he embraces and kisses his son, and then holds a great feast to celebrate the return of his son. For Jesus, this is what the kingdom of God is like, and that it is through forgiveness that salvation is made possible, not through conquest, but rather mercy, just like it is for Frodo. But we might wonder, was this all just quite lucky that Gollum appeared at the right time, at the right place? What if he hadn't been there? Would the ring have just remained? Was it just chance or an accident? Well, Tolkien gives us a different interpretation of the story. In an early passage, Gandalf and Frodo are discussing how Bilbo found the ring, which is described in The Hobbit. Gandalf says the following: "It was the strangest event in the whole history of the ring so far. Bilbo's arrival just at that time, and putting his hand on it blindly in the dark. There was more than one power at work, Frodo. The ring was trying to get back to its master. So now, when its master was awake once more and sending out his dark thought from Mirkwood, it abandoned Gollum, only to be picked up by the most unlikely person imaginable, Bilbo from the Shire. Behind that, there was something else at work, beyond any design of the ringmaker. I can put it no plainer than by saying that Bilbo was meant to find the ring, and not by its maker, in which case you also were meant to have it. And that is an encouraging thought. Throughout The Lord of the Rings, you will find little references here and there to this idea that Frodo was meant to have the ring, that he was appointed or chosen to carry the ring. And this by some other or higher power, which directs the course of history. There is an intentionality to all of the events that take place, a hidden hand in history which brings all things through the free actions of creatures to fruition, to its design. And when you look at the episodes within the story, there is a certain pattern one can detect which maybe shows this element of design. We can see it in the three characters that we've already studied. Gandalf, it looks like he is gone forever, but then he comes back. With Aragorn, the city is about to be destroyed, and he arrives just in time to save it. With Frodo, it looks like all is lost, that defeat is on the horizon. And then, just in time, unintentionally, Gollum saves the day. What we can see then is a pattern of the heroes being in a tight spot, that it looks like the evil side is going to win, that defeat is on the horizon, and all we can feel is despair. And then, just at that moment, rescue arrives, good triumphs over evil, and the reader feels great joy. For Tolkien, this pattern, which he identified within his own work, points to the pattern of history, that it signifies something about reality itself. And for him, this is the central story of the gospel. He and C.S. Lewis would call this the myth made fact, or myth and history intertwined. For Tolkien, the human condition is a desperate one. Because of our propensity to choose evil rather than good, we are suffering the consequences of sin. We face death and finally judgment in hell. But for Tolkien, there has been a great reversal, the coming of Jesus Christ, God entering into human history through the incarnation to rescue humanity from the consequences of sin and death through the cross and resurrection. In turn, the resurrection is itself a reversal. When Christ died on the cross, the disciples were distraught. They believed that all of the goodness and light of Jesus' life, that his mission to bring the kingdom of God into the world, had been crushed. But Tolkien says, the resurrection was the great rescue, the great reversal of that seeming ultimate defeat. And so for Tolkien, mythology has a quite important place. Remember, I was talking about those deep truths he felt that were being forgotten in his own day. Because these legends, these tales, point towards, for him, the great myth, the myth that's in history, that of the gospel. To that end, I want to close with some words from a poem that Tolkien wrote in 1931 called Mythopoeia. And it came about from a conversation he had with C.S. Lewis at that time. Blessed are the legend makers with their rhyme of things not found within recorded time. It is not they that have forgot the night, or bid us flee to organized delight. In lotus isles of economic bliss, forswearing souls to gain a Circe kiss, and counterfeit at that, machine-produced, bogus seduction of the twice seduced. Such isles they saw afar, and ones more fair, and those that hear them yet may yet beware. They have seen death and ultimate defeat, and yet they would not in despair retreat, but off to victory have turned the lyre, and kindled hearts with legendary fire, illuminating now, and dark hath been, with light of suns, as yet by no man seen. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much to Nathan for that talk. And we've got now some chance to ask some questions. So would anyone like to ask a question? If you're able to use this microphone, that would really help the folks who are watching on the stream. Marianne.
Thank you, Nathan. What about the elves?
The elves. Is there something in particular you want to know about the elves, or?
Significance. What is the significance?
So, I mean, there's a lot of different ways you could take that, but I think one of them for Tolkien is in one of the other works he wrote, the Silmarillion. There is this idea that the God of the world has given elves and men different gifts. For the elves, it is immortality. For humanity, it is mortality. And the elves, they struggle with their immortality in various ways because they want to make paradise in the world, as it were, because they're living in the world forever. But for Tolkien, paradise only belongs in the heavenly realms, as it were, in Valinor, where the angelic beings are. And so the temptation for the elves is this danger of trying to make what should be in heaven on earth in an inappropriate way through their own power. And this is how the rings actually get made, because they want to, Sauron tricks them into creating the rings because they want to make paradise on earth through the power of the rings. And he uses this to abuse, to take them over, essentially. The other side of it as well, though, is because they are immortal, they see things pass and fade. And this is tied into the desire for paradise on earth, because nothing within the world is permanent. It is always going to decay and fade. And so they have to live with a certain weariness of things that they can't preserve any longer. Whereas for human beings, because they are not bound to immortality, in a sense, they are able to live in the world more comfortably, because they pass with it too. They change with it too. But they have their own problems as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. That was really interesting. Talking about elves, how do you see the significance of Bilbo leaving with the elves? Because they withdraw from this world, don't they? And they take Bilbo with him. He doesn't actually die. Mm-hmm. What would you see that as a significant point?
Mm. So I think there's a couple of aspects which are interesting about Bilbo and Frodo in relation to the elves. One is just the fact that they love elvish culture. Most hobbits are quite insular and love their own communities, but find anything else very strange, very odd and unusual. But Frodo and Bilbo are unusually open to other cultures and love the beauty and wisdom of the elves. So they are already not quite like everybody else and they love the Shire, their home, but they don't quite fit into it. And when the story is completed, there is this sense that a new age has come into being, one where the old order has passed away, which includes the rings of the elves and their power and their magic. And so the elves need to leave the Middle-earth at that point. As Frodo and Bilbo were themselves ring-bearers, they too belong to the old order. And so they have no place again within the current world. They need to pass out of it for it to come to its full fruition. And you can kind of see that with the character of Sam, because Sam, he's one of the people's favorite characters because he absolutely loves Frodo and will do anything for Frodo. He's the sort of friend everybody wants to have. But after the quest is complete, Sam has this kind of tension between loyalty to Frodo and to investing fully in his family, in his new family with Rosie. And one of the things that I think Frodo implies to Sam is that by him leaving, Sam will be able to fully live in this new age with his family and let go of Frodo. So I think you can see there that there's this idea of, to move into this new era, the old has to move away, both on a kind of cosmic level and in a very personal way too.
Thanks, Nathan. That was really interesting. The character of Tom Bombadil. You were talking earlier about the series of stories of peril and rescue. Do you think that Tom is just a device to tell one of those stories, or do you think he has any wider spiritual significance within the book?
So you've hit on one of the big debates within Tolkien scholarship. Who is Tom Bombadil and what is his importance? Just for kind of broader sake, Tom Bombadil appears in the story quite early on. Frodo and a couple of his friends have set out on their quest, and they decide to go through the Old Forest to escape from one of Sauron's servants. As they do so, they are kind of being led into a part of the forest they don't want to be in. And eventually, two of Frodo's friends get trapped in a tree called Old Man Willow. At that point, Frodo cries out, "Help!" And suddenly this fun character appears called Tom Bombadil. He is a rather rotund fellow with red rosy cheeks and always smiling and singing. And he skips along and helps out the hobbits. He says he knows the tune for Old Man Willow, sings into the bark, and Old Man Willow releases them. I think with Tom you can see a number of parallels to Christ. So one of the aspects is when Frodo asks Tom's wife Goldberry, "Who is Tom?" she says, "He is." And if you look at the story of Moses in the burning bush, God describes himself as, what is your name? I am. And Christ also says that I am. So there is this very clear identification. Tom is described as the master. He is described as the eldest and the first, who knows all things and has seen all things. And by the power of his song, he is able to command beings to do what he desires. So he can sing to Old Man Willow, and Old Man Willow releases the hobbits. Very much as Christ can command demons to leave a person, and they leave. Or he can command somebody to, "You be healed," and you are healed. And moreover, this harrowing of hell idea that I was talking about earlier, both with Old Man Willow and later when the hobbits are trapped by the Barrow-wight ghosts in a mound, there is this sense that Bombadil releases people from the underworld so that they can have life again. I think, though, that while there definitely is this parallel there, some people have said this means that Bombadil is kind of an incarnation of God within Middle-earth. Others would say maybe he's an angelic figure. I think that he within the world itself, he is a creature of the world, because his knowledge only seems to go back to the very beginning of creation, not before it. And in the Silmarillion, there are stories before the creation of Middle-earth, where there are other beings. So it seems that Tom maybe belongs to the world itself, but he represents certain aspects of the divine in Tolkien's mind, not least in the idea that Tom puts limitations upon himself. He's clearly a very powerful character. The ring has no effect upon him. He doesn't desire it. But he chooses not to leave his country, his land. I think for Tolkien, this reflects the idea that for his view, God allows freedom. He allows creatures to have freedom and make choices that are wrong. God limits himself not imposing his will. Whereas the dark characters, the villains in the story, always try to impose their will upon other people. Sauron wants to crush the freedom of others. It's always posed in that way, the free peoples, so that they all play to his tune. So I think Bombadil definitely represents something on a spiritual level and has many parallels to God and Tolkien's ideas about what God is like. Yeah. Thank you.
In terms of Tom Bombadil, the nearest I've got is that he's some kind of a cross between the Holy Spirit and the Green Man. But my question is, what can you tell me about Frodo's incurable wound? Incurable wound,
yes. So for context, on his quest, Frodo is attacked by the Ringwraiths, which are servants of Sauron. These are men who took rings from Sauron in the promise of power, but in so doing lost their own will, as it were. So again, this idea of will, and became ghostly forms. They are neither living nor dead. One of these Ringwraiths stabs Frodo with a certain kind of blade, and ever after the quest, Frodo feels the pain of this. It never goes away. In part, this is why he leaves Middle-earth, because he's never found true rest or peace after the story is over, so he needs to go out, leave this world, as it were, to find healing. But the actual significance of it, I think there's at least one or two. One of them, as far as I can see, is the story of Jacob wrestling with God. That when Jacob, in that night, wrestles with this individual, he leaves it a transformed man, one who is willing to have reconciliation with his brother Esau, but forevermore he has this injury to his hip. There is this sense that one comes out of the experience of wrestling with the divine, or has been changed by the divine, that one is changed in some way, in an irrevocable way. But there is some degree of pain that comes with that never seems to go away. Paul talks about the thorn in his flesh, or the constant battle of the old and the new man in this life. The other kind of reference could be that when Christ is resurrected, the wounds of the crucifixion remain in his body. They are not obliterated, they stay there. And so it's not something which is just passed over by the resurrection. It's brought up into the being of this new creation. Those are the two kind of aspects that I've seen. But if you've got any other further ideas, I'd love to hear them.
It's my perception, Nathan, that Tolkien didn't really become well known or his works popular until the 1960s. In other words, in my perception, and I'm going to ask you if I'm right in a minute, in my perception, he had to wait, as it were, for the climate to change. And I don't mean global warming either, I mean the whole kind of mental and spiritual climate, indeed, to change, as with the arrival of the hippies and so on. Mm-hmm. Some of us, remember the 60s, and but perhaps I'm quite wrong. So I'd be interested in what you think about that.
I think he definitely became quite popular amongst hippies during the 60s, and many major bands were quite influenced by Tolkien during that period. The Beatles famously wanted to do a film where John Lennon would have been Gollum and Paul McCartney would have been Frodo. But I think it's towards the end of the 60s and the early 70s where it really gets channeled into the pop culture of the time. I mentioned Led Zeppelin. You could also see T-Rex, the Uriah Heep, Black Sabbath. I think for all of them, they found that he offered a glimpse of something which they felt had been lost in their own time, that materialism wasn't sufficing or satisfying, and that he had an imagination and a set of values which they thought were powerful, could in some way restore the world. You see this in Led Zeppelin with the very idea that they think their songs have a kind of magical power. You can see this similar to Tom Bombadil, right? And many of the characters within their songs kind of display this constant battle of light and dark. I think also as well that this gets taken up with Crowleyism, the kind of magical beliefs of Aleister Crowley, that was a significant movement during the 60s, and Tolkien kind of fits in with that. And famously, he used to get phone calls from hippies late in the middle of the night while he was living in the south of England. They would have various questions. They'd been maybe taking some magic mushrooms or something and had a question about Tom Bombadil or Gandalf. And he used to get very infuriated by these telephone calls in the middle of the night. But yeah, I think that there is definitely a sudden opening for Tolkien during the 60s. I would need to think more about why that is the case specifically. But then you have a further kind of opening up in the early 2000s with the film, where I think it becomes much more mainstream than it did before. I think at that point it was, in certain subcultures, Tolkien was a big deal, and people maybe read him, but it wasn't kind of mass accessible. And again, I would need to think more about why it becomes suddenly so successful at that point in history, at the cusp of the millennium too. Yeah. Food for thought, thank you.
Is that all the questions? Any? Maybe I could pose a question. So you mentioned, Nathan, that you saw myth as a kind of truth. We tend to think of myth as a kind of untruth, really. So can you explain a wee bit more about how he understood myth and what he meant by the idea that kind of stories, maybe Nordic stories, stories of the Anglo-Saxons and so on, could actually point to Christ? It just seems a very odd idea.
Well, let me kind of put the point even sharper for Tolkien, in that he famously wrote that one scholar had said that the electric car is the most real thing in the world. And he said, nonsense. Anybody that thinks cars are more real than dragons is absolutely absurd. Now, why could Tolkien say such a thing like that? Well, I think for him, myth, ancient myth, like the Norse sagas or the Iliad, really point to the moral character of human nature, what's really true about it, and that it's not just we're not just material beings, and we're not just economic beings, but there's actually good and evil, and we wrestle with it in a number of different ways. And he believed that mythology can really help us to see this through what he called recovery. He thought that when you read a fantasy story, it presents to you things that we take for granted, ordinary things, in a new way. We see something new about them. So for example, the Ents in The Lord of the Rings are walking and living tree-like beings. And they show us trees then in a slightly different way. We encounter them not just as stationary objects, not just something that we can use as a resource, but as an independent reality from ourselves, with their own existence, with their own needs, and their own kind of flourishing. What mythology and fantasy does then is it makes us appreciate the otherness of the world beyond ourselves, that we see it not just as something dependent or defined by how we think about it, but actually something which has its own dignity. He would talk about us then moving away from appropriating things, being overly familiar with things, to actually having a love for other things. And so I think he would see mythology and fantasy as having this vital role in attuning our perception to what's really in the world, and thus transforming our attitude to what's in reality as well.
So, I mean, Nathan's shared a lot with us tonight. He just talked a moment ago about seeing old things in new ways, and perhaps he's helped us do that a little, whilst not taking away from the fun of just seeing it as a story that we can enjoy. I think he's enriched the possibility of seeing The Lord of the Rings and maybe other stories like that as something that can have deep messages, deep truths, or deep insights embraced within them, which I think enriches our reading of these stories whilst we can enjoy them on different levels as well. So please join me now again in expressing our thanks to Nathan for all the work that he's done tonight in helping us appreciate Lord of the Rings. We can go on appreciating Lord of the Rings as we go through for a cup of tea or coffee and a piece of cake. But thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you very much to Rita for providing the tea, coffee and cake.